Now, the gazetted deadline for the 22nd of June for public comments in the Basic Education Laws Amendment Bill has come and gone, but the debate rages on among stakeholders about its impact on the equal treatment of languages in schools. The Democratic Alliance has already accused some basic education officials of an attempt to undermine Afrikaans in schools, but some believe the bill may also encourage multilingualism in South Africa's schools. Joining us now to discuss this further, we invited NAPTOSA, we invited the Institute of Race Relations, as well as a professor in language schooling to help us in the conversation. We have with us from NAPTOSA, Basil Manuel. Good to have you with us, and thank you very much for coming on. Gabriel Crouse of the Institute of Race Relations and the University of Cape Town's Professor Carolyn McKinney. It started in 2017. Good evening to you all, by the way. It has taken us 5 years, barring, of course, 2 years of the pandemic, where not much was really happening as far as the work of Parliament. But 5 years later, I think it was in November 2021 that it was introduced to Parliament. In February, the Parliament Portfolio Committee got this particular process underway. Key amongst these is to respond to court judgments that protect and give effect to the Bill of Rights. And one of the issues that this sought to address is compulsory school for grade R learners. Let's start with the 5,000 submissions or so that have been made around this particular bill. Is there a feeling, by indication, maybe in majority or minority, that indeed there is a feeling, Basil, that the improvements are needed as far as the current education laws are concerned?
Tawa, good evening, and good evening to the fellow panelists. At first, let me say that it preceded 2017 because, of course, there were drafts, etc., before it got to Parliament or the Portfolio Committee. And we have commented extensively on it. And this is a greatly improved version of what was originally there. Particularly in terms of the governing bodies and their role, functions, etc., there was a much greater attempt to water that down. Now, I'm not suggesting that the draft we have is perfect, but certainly it has been a great improvement. And the process of democracy by commenting is a good one, because there are various people that have concerns. Not that every concern is necessarily absolutely valid for everybody else, particularly when it comes to issues of language. It's contested terrain, and people will always be fighting for what they think is a marginalization of their own language. And this is where we have to be very careful. And even as a teacher union, we've thrown our weight behind the fact that we need to be progressing on mother tongue instruction. There's sufficient evidence and research that suggests that this is the best way to go. However, we've also cautioned about how we go about it and how we ensure that when we have, let's call them our African languages as languages of instruction, that we have sufficient text and that we have sufficient training for teachers to teach in that tongue. Because it is not an automatic thing that people are always there and ready. And so there's a lot that has gone on with this. And what I want to say is, I think there's still room for improvement. And that's what our comment will also indicate that has already gone through.
All right. In Parliament, Professor McKinney, when the department was presenting this to the lawmakers, they said, we are pleased that after 5 years it's finally got in your hands, and we trust that this will be a process that will transform public schools in the province, because they believe that the education laws have been a key stumbling block to transformation. Would you agree with that view?
Well, I think when it comes to language policy in schools, and particularly actually in the minority of schools, which are the fee-collecting, historically white schools in suburbs, the leeway the power that school governing bodies have to determine the language policy hasn't really enabled the teaching of African languages in those historically white schools. So you will find, certainly in the Western Cape, in Gauteng and the Eastern Cape, it's a little bit better, but generally speaking, the apartheid policy of English and Afrikaans is still what's going on. So, still the same as when I was at school in the 70s and the 80s, Afrikaans was compulsory alongside English, and that's the case in most of these ex-Model C schools. Now, those are a minority of schools, but I do believe in those schools that the school governing bodies need encouragement into introducing African languages, because it's 2022, so many years post-apartheid. 1997 was when our language and education policy came in. And if they haven't shifted by now, then they're not going to do it on their own without encouragement. And of course, for me, in terms of language policy, there was always the case that the school's language policy is supposed to be confirmed by the provincial department. So the fact that it needs to be confirmed by a director in the provincial department is not a major change, for me. Then on the other side, I think what is positive in terms of multilingualism is that the bill proposes that a director in the province may suggest that a school adds a language of learning and teaching, so that they have more than one language of learning and teaching in the school. And we know in South Africa we have one of the most successful bilingual education systems, but unfortunately that has only been available to a minority of white Afrikaans and English speakers. But historically, we have the longest and the most experienced bilingual education offering, with parallel medium and dual medium, particularly when the two languages are offered in the same classroom. And those children in their schooling in grade 12, fluent, beautifully fluent in both those languages. Yeah. So I think, imagine if we could have that with our African languages as well, where all our children leave school fluent in two languages. They can have both home language and English, not having to choose, and being the kinds of multilingual citizens that the 1997 language policy actually envisioned.
Gabriel, let's bring you in here. Removing the components, which I'm sure we are going to debate at length right now, the component of the language policy, the component of the admissions policy, the overall view of the Institute of Race Relations on the amendments, barring those two issues which we're going to get into.
Sure, thank you. I think the biggest frustration that we have with the Bella Bill amendment is that it basically takes more power away from parents and puts more power in the hands of a government that has already proved itself basically world record bad at education. So around 2017, which is when this instance of the bill sort of was tabled by the committee, The Economist magazine published an article headlined, "South Africa's got the world's worst public school system, bang for buck." And that was off the back of, for example, the fact that 1 in 5 grade 4s can read, which is the worst in the world on the international studies that test reading for meaning in grade 4 and grade 5. And in English and Afrikaans, which according to Professor Howie of Stellenbosch University were the only groups large enough that you could make a comparison from 2006 through 2011 through 2016, which is when the latest studies available, it was actually declining from about, from better than 20% to 20%. So things are as bad as they've ever been. They're worse. Secondly, the Institute of Race Relations has long been tracking the matric pass rate, not as the number that the government publishes, but as the real number, which takes grade 1s and traces them through, as best as statistically possible, through to grade 12, and then sees how many have passed at that stage. Because otherwise, you forget about those people who've dropped out, those people who've been left behind. And that's not good enough. We shouldn't be living in a country where we leave behind most children. In fact, the effective pass rate for mathematics, as we calculated, is about 5%. And that's what explains, in my mind, why the youth unemployment rate is at about 2/3, why the not in education employment or training rate is above 55% for people between 24 and 34. We've got a very, very terrible education system, and it's not because we're not spending money on it. It's the highest line item on the budget outside of repaying our debts, which is just not a choice. So we say the government's proven that it can't do the job. Parents, generally speaking, love their children. parents have the best interests of their children at heart.
Yeah.
We would like to see more power go in the opposite direction, away from governments towards parents, not just towards parents' bodies that get to decide things like language bodies, but towards parents putting money in their pockets, or at least putting scholarship voucher money in their pocket, so that they can be liberated from the awful government schools where teachers don't show up on Friday or Monday, where education is too often just completely lacking, and send them to low-cost private schools if if the parents believe that's going to be better for them. And then let the parents decide whether the kids should learn in English or Afrikaans or Zulu or Xhosa. Frankly, with all respect to the professor, I think that parents are going to know better in their particular situation what's going to be good for their kids than anyone sitting in an ivory tower or sitting in Pretoria trying to dictate to the whole country how everyone should be. Let parents choose. That's our call.
Legislative reforms then and the feasibility of language policies interrogated further when we continue next. Basil Manuel, Gabriel Crouse, as well as Professor McKinney staying with us. And we'll take your views as well. 072-110-5584. Tweet us tonight at Newzroom 405. We're back with you tonight on In Focus and, of course, the amendments to the basic education laws of the country under discussion. Basil Manuel, Gabriel Crouse, as well as Professor Carolyn McKinney. So let's get to it then. The big issue, I suppose, of contention here is this provision that provides that the head of department may direct a public school to adopt more than one language of instruction where it is practical to do so, that if the head of department issues such directive, he or she must take all necessary steps to ensure that the public school receives the necessary resource to enable it to provide adequate tuition in the additional language of instruction. Why is this particular implication seemingly a concern? Basil, let's start with you.
Trouble, it is seen as sinister because people believe that if you add a language, you're automatically going to discount the other one. Now, that can't be completely true. But of course, because people are involved, it can also become a reality. But we can't have schools that have a particular language and then have 50% of the school half empty classrooms, because we're sticking to one language, whilst the context in which the school is located, the people around the school are changing. All our areas are super dynamic, people are moving around, and of course even language clusters are changing. So it isn't wrong to say we do need some form of oversight over whether a school is fully occupied and fully functional. We are concerned that too much authority mustn't be vested in administration, because we do believe that governing bodies should have sufficient authority. But we also know of terrible governing bodies. We mustn't paint the picture that every governing body has been hyper successful. In fact, there are many more that haven't been. And we mustn't talk about the minority of governing bodies that have actually been successful. However, we still believe that the whole idea of ensuring that parents are more involved is the right one. So our concern and the concern people have about something being foisted on them has to be carefully looked at. Now, I know there are provisions in the bill that say then you must go through certain steps before it can be done. But we know if the head of department is making a decision and you are appealing to the MEC, what are the chances that the MEC is going to overturn his head of department's decision? And that is where some of the flaws come in. Yeah. We believe that there can be better ways of ensuring that justice prevails.
Okay.
But
what are those better ways? Because this is one of the questions that was put to Parliament, to say how schools who refuse to add additional languages, even when they were not at capacity, should be handled.
We believe there are many people within a community, people of legal standing, of academia and so on, that can sit on a panel, that can be part of a decision-making panel to look at whether the objections of a school are real or not. It can't be vested in one person only, and that person is closely tied to the decision maker. There are many, many ways in which we can do this. And what we are saying is we mustn't disempower the level which in 1994 we looked at as taking governance, taking decision-making to as far to the ground as possible. Now we are removing it, simply because it is convenient to do so. And that is what NAPTOSA is objecting to.
Yeah. Prof, the MEC, particularly for education here in Gauteng, arguing very strongly on this, saying, what is wrong with arguing that we should all be taught in our home languages? I mean, this is part of what the head of department will do. He will insist that add an additional language and that learners should not then therefore be deprived of attending that school just because there will be an SGB, which in most instances, or some instances, let me say so, have used their powers in the opposite direction and have not allowed certain learners to come into the school on grounds of language.
Yes, I mean, I think that is the case, that we've seen that language policies of schools and their admissions policies are very closely tied. And very often in the admission policy, in many of the schools' policies that I've looked at, and again, I'm talking about the elite, historically white schools, not the typical schools in the country, will have clauses which say that the child, if it's an English medium school, needs to have sufficient English so as not to impede their ability to progress, assuming that if they were in a school where, say, an African language was the language of learning and teaching, that they would carry on with that. But in grade 4, every single child, apart from Afrikaans language medium schools, every single child has to switch to English as the medium of instruction for all of their subjects, every single textbook, every assessment, and they follow the exact same curriculum as the English-speaking children who come in with 6 years of English already. So it's not as if they can go down the road and go to a school where they're being taught in isiXhosa or in isiZulu or so on. Those schools don't exist in South Africa at the moment. And so using language as a way to exclude children from schooling is actually something that should just not be in admissions policies. It shouldn't be allowed. Now, those admissions policies are supposed to be checked by the province, and so are the language policies of those schools. And yet I have seen many of them in my research where that clause is there, and it's the same clause that you'll find replicated across, which means that's come from a pro forma from somewhere, because it's very strange that you see exactly the same clause in admission policies across a range of schools.
Yeah.
And I do also, it's not responding to this question, but I do want to just make a point in response to Gabriel that, in fact, the work that I do in schools with teachers every year on a consistent basis, I see many, many extremely hardworking, dedicated, committed teachers. So I do feel that we actually need to support our teachers who are really doing an impossible job, actually. How would you like to teach children who don't understand the language that you are teaching in every single day, all day, without any kinds of support in their home languages at all the materials being in a foreign language? I know I could not do that job. Those teachers are doing a job that I, with a PhD and with all my years of teaching, I couldn't do that.
Gabriel, let's talk to that then. The head of department, it says here, when considering the admissions policy or any amendment thereof for approval, must be satisfied that the policy or the amendment thereof takes into account the needs in general of the broader community in which the public school is located. Wouldn't you say that is in the best interest of the child?
No, exactly not. Thank you so much for highlighting that clause of the Bella Bill. I think it speaks very directly to our central complaint there. It just is the case that there are conflicts of interest between whatever you're going to define as the broader community interest and the interest of a particular child. And this is something that anybody who belongs to a family is going to understand. Families are, in a sense, kind of selfish, but they're a kind of selfish organization that our society as South Africa is overwhelmingly supportive of. The idea that you take care of your own kids first, the idea that you put a roof over the heads of your own kids, the idea that as a parent who's struggling, you go that extra mile to be able to put school shoes on your own kids, is an idea that motivates a lot of very poor, a lot of very hardworking and very disciplined South Africans. Charity begins at home is a phrase that dates back and that has analogs in a variety of languages for a simple reason. When it comes to child rearing, there is a kind of focused attention that needs to be given to the particular individual in question. And when you have a classroom, to the particular kids in the classroom. It's not uncommon for teachers to, for example, remove troublemakers from the classroom because they're getting in the way of all the other kids in the room and they're trying to protect them. Much more if there's someone coming from the outside to try and keep them away so that you can protect the kids in the room. Now, I don't have a particularly strong view on the language policy matter other than the fact that the Constitution guarantees through the principle of subsidiarity that where single medium institutions are working effectively, they are protected under the diversity protections of official languages. The Constitution doesn't speak about African languages and English and Afrikaans. It just speaks about the official languages of South Africa, which is the country we all belong to. Yeah. But when it comes to admission, I think there is a key point, which is that the number of pupils in the last 2 decades has increased by 900,000, almost 1 million, whereas the number of schools has decreased by about 3,500. That has created a community need. That's the quote that you were reading, a huge community need with not enough schools to match all of the pupils. Yeah. And the result is overcrowding. Right. And if you've got an overcrowded school where 60 kids are being stuffed into a classroom or sitting outside under a tree, then another school where there's only 20 kids can seem as if it's half empty. Whereas, in fact, that is a good amount of space to meet those students. Yeah. And the teachers and the parents and the student body and everything needs to try and keep those students in a position where they can be part of the 5% that passes mathematics. And the government needs to do whatever is possible to get the other 95% up. We can't cut down the few successes that we have. Basil, unfortunately, made many good points, but he said, let's not talk about the successes. We have to talk about the successes, because as I read it, what the Basil Bill wants to do is cut down those successes, overcrowd every school so that we achieve a quality, not a quality of excellence, but a quality of complete failure. And that's the opposite of what most South Africans need. It's the opposite of what most South Africans want. Okay. And it's the opposite of what we'd get if we let parents decide what school they want to send their kids to, in what language, using a voucher system, rather than a centralized planning administrative nightmare that's just already not working. Notwithstanding all the good teachers, it's the administrators that are letting
Let's hear what the educators have to say about that. I'm somewhat defeated by what you're raising, Gabriel. You're saying let's protect the kids in the room by leaving others outside and just teaching these ones in their preferred Afrikaans language because we are a selfish family and that's what we want to do. I'm sorry, I'm failing to understand this. Basil?
The government must help. It's the government's duty, not those parents, not that school. It's the government's duty. In our Constitution, it says the government is obliged to provide children with an education. Not you or me, the whole government together.
All right, let's hear what Basil has to say.
Let me add this. No, Gabriel is misconstruing what I said. I'm not saying ignore those that are doing well. I'm saying you can't focus only on them. And certainly, you can't speak as though a class of 20 is okay, and across the road where there's a class of 50, it is also okay, because we must protect the class of 20. It can't be. Neither is NAPTOSA, and never would NAPTOSA advocate for the overcrowding of classes. We are actually fighting against the overcrowding of classes. We want more schools. We also want to see quality teaching. But I can't also support a view that says that we must be promoting the privatization of education. In a country like South Africa, you've got to look at the reality. Quality public schools is the reality. And it is misplaced to suggest that all schools are failing schools. Even the schools that are sitting with 60 and 70 children per class. And I will tell you, I have been a teacher for 30 years. I've been a principal for 18 years. And I will tell you, I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. And it is very easy to talk about how simple it is to address those problems. But come and stand in front of a class of 50, and then you will give your left leg, your left arm, for that matter, to be in a class of 20. Yes, let's strive to get there. But let us not pretend that today in South Africa we should protect a class of 20 against a class of 80, when in fact we could make both their lives a little better. We need integration, and we definitely need language integration. I am saying to you, Thabo, and to other guests, that language integration becomes critical. And I think Carolyn made a very important point.
Let me take a break.
We'll
come back and expand on that a little bit. Let's look at some of the messages, and then we'll come back and wrap this conversation as well with our panel tonight. On WhatsApp, Safenda's Mashishi in Polokwane saying, it's not about language, it's about the minority denying the majority affluent public facilities by using language as a medium of exclusion. Spirit Olanim Kiza saying language policy should be moved from SGB to departmental officials since it is being used by SGBs to exclude other races for admission in certain schools. We'll continue more with your views and our panel tonight. Basil Manuel of NAPTOSA, Gabriel Crouse from the Institute of Race Relations, and the University of Cape Town Professor Carolyn McKinney. Stay with us. Back tonight on In Focus, of course, amendments to the education laws of the country under focus tonight. This as we discuss the various sections of the amendment bill that are, of course, quite problematic, and they've got a lot of people talking about them. Prof, before the break, we were talking about that concept of saying, well, just because the school next door is overcrowded, it doesn't mean when you look this side, this side is undercapacitated. All right, and therefore, let us protect this school and keep those numbers there because that's why they're getting the results as opposed to overcrowding them, and therefore maybe build other schools, I suppose, for the other overcrowded schools.
I think that Mr. Manuel was talking to that point. Did you want to complete that point, Mr. Manuel? I mean, I what you were saying.
No, you can carry on.
Well, you know, I don't think that I can add. I think you explained the way that I would see it as well, is that we cannot protect the 20 and expect that that's fair to the 50 across the road. We have to actually have a fairer system than that, I think. And I agree with you that private education is not a viable option. Quality public schooling is the way that we need to meet the needs of children in South Africa, and that is where we need to put resources. I think that people forget, you know, when I hear this thing about the expenditure, and of course I'm not an economist, I'm a language and literacy specialist, but one thing that I do know from understanding our history is that the line items are referring to what we are spending now. But when we ended apartheid, we never had a major reconstruction and development program for our schools where we put in several, you know, injections to infrastructure and to actually say, right, how are we going to actually bring this up to speed? So we've got a funding formula which, yes, gives more money to children in non-fee collecting schools than the fee collecting. But if you look at the income in fee collecting schools, it is not even 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times. It is like 20 times and more. And I don't have those figures on me. I wish I'd looked them up because it's not my field. But for sure, it is astronomically more than what children are getting per capita in our fee-free public schools. And we have never had that cash injection. What happened was that the historically white schools were handed over to those communities. They can use their grounds to generate income by renting out their facilities. They can do all sorts of things to increase their funds, effectively like semi-private schools. And then we think, well, they're the ones that are functioning, you know, compared to the others, and we wonder why. There's so many advantages that those schools have, and language is only one of them. The fact that they have small classes is only one of them. So it's not fair to actually say, well, really, the rest of the schools, government's spending the money and it's just being wasted. We have never actually invested post-apartheid in the schooling system in the way we needed to get rid of the infrastructure backlogs, for one thing.
We're going to come to you in a moment, Gabriel. I know you want to jump in there. Basil, one issue, though, which I'm sure you wanted to also talk about is the appointment of principals. This particular responsibility now seemingly, according to this clause, the minister with the authority will be the one appointing a person or an organization or a group of persons to advise on the curriculum and assessment-related matters, meaning that role, which others are arguing, by the way, was never the role of SGBs to start with. They only recommended, it was still the department that appointed rather. It's just the component of recommending that has been taken now back to the department. What's your feeling on that?
Well, we have a problem with that because, once again, it waters down the authority of governing bodies. We believe that the majority of governing bodies have actually done well in terms of handling the appointment of appropriate people in schools. Yes, there have been problems, and there are still problems today. I don't want to create the impression that there hasn't been corruption and things like that that have gone with it. However, we must fix the corruption. We can't give it over to a system where we know some of those people are incompetent. We know there are questions about work ethic, etc. And let me take one province. Take KZN, for example, where we have a very large Department of Education, and every time there is a promotions bulletin, we are talking about 6,000 posts. How do you take that and put it in the hands of a small group of people? We will not see tiniest appointment of people happening. So it is fraught with problems. And we believe that the system where governing bodies went through the process, and they were guided, by the way, they weren't doing it on their own, there were experts there as well, and then made the recommendations. Now we know that in 99% of the cases, the people who were recommended were appointed. But where there was obvious issues that arose, then there were questions asked. And we believe it was still the best. We are very concerned that there are people, and sometimes politically aligned people, sitting in the departments that will be appointed to oversee these processes. How can that possibly be better when we have come from this cadre deployment problem, and it still persists? And we can then see that certain groups of people are going to be disadvantaged more. Thabo, I cannot support something that says it will be a better system.
But then what do we do where we've seen disputed appointments, particularly appointments of black principals in schools that, for example, are in colored or white communities, and the communities, they're up in arms because of those appointments, which were done by SGBs, by the way.
Look, one can't speak to that and say that it is okay. If the process was okay, if it has been passed that it has been okay, then it's simply nonsense. It's racism. And we can't be tolerant of that type of behavior. And yes, sometimes people stand up and make a whole lot of fuss. But the reality is, if it is the best person for the job, we will stand with that person. We are not interested in the color or creed or whatever of the person. We are saying the process must be fair, it must be transparent, and the best person must get the job. Too often, even in completely black areas, we find that communities are throwing out principals because their person of choice that happened to be from down the road has not gotten the post. We can't tolerate that. It is still a better system. But, Thabo, I want to say, let's fix the problems that raise their heads. Let's not scrap the whole system and pretend that the system we are creating now is automatically going to be better. There are too many things that are pointing in a direction that says it may be worse.
Okay. Gabriel, take a bite of those two issues then. Maybe you can respond to what has been said. I have about 2 minutes or so left.
Okay, great. I just want to say amen to when Basil was saying there's just no room in this country for judging people by the color of their skin and trying to degrade them on that basis. You've got to get the best person for the job. Absolutely, amen and hallelujah to that. I think that can't be said enough. I think that in terms of, I just want to reiterate this point. If you've got a school that's overcrowded and a school that's sitting at a good capacity for effective learning, the solution is not to semi-overcrowd the one to bring down the other. The solution is to build a new school. That is absolutely what should have been done. Now, Professor McKinney said that she doesn't have the numbers and wants to blame the very low performance maybe on the infrastructure backlog. This is not because of a lack of funds, and also it maybe misses the point that from 2006 to 2016, reading in grade 4, for example, dropped dramatically. The number of students who could read for meaning dropped dramatically. So you can't blame that all on an apartheid-era infrastructure backlog, because that's a decrease between 2006 and 2016. What happens at that same period is a ramification of the kind of political, nepotistic appointment systems that are not putting quality of personnel first, and that are instead putting either sort of clan, little political affiliations or ideology first, that's what's not good enough. I don't know, I'm not smart enough, sitting from Joburg, far away from the rural heartland of South Africa, where schools are letting, for the most part, most students down completely. As I was saying, 5% effective matric maths pass rate. I don't know how to solve that problem all in one go. I do think that the best resource we have is the goodwill of teachers that are prepared to do their job good and hard, and of parents that are prepared to go and seek out those teachers. And right now, as long as we sit in a system, a public school system, where the government sets up public schools, the government procures, the government administrates, I don't see how our government, which can't keep the lights on, which can't keep the water flowing, which can't keep the sewage out of the streets in most of the rural parts of Free State and KZN that I go and visit in my work, I don't know how that government can be expected to turn around the world's worst public school system on a bang for buck basis. I do believe that South Africa has what it takes. I believe that what it takes is parents getting more freedom to choose, and children getting the opportunity to thrive in the environments that their parents have chosen for them, under the language that their parents choose for them. That's what we advocate for. That's the submission we made to the Bill, and that's what we're going to be lobbying for in the Department of Basic Education, in the Parliamentary Committee. Give parents the freedom to choose. Thank you.
Gabriel Crouse, appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming through. From the Institute of Race Relations, University of Cape Town's Professor Carolyn McKinney, and NAPTOSA's Basil Manuel. Let's look at what you are saying tonight on this conversation. Sabirwa in Pretoria, it doesn't make sense at the end of the day to have Afrikaans medium schools and not have Zulu medium schools in South Africa. Why is that privilege only for Afrikaans? This is a reason for exclusivity and supremacy. Fazler saying the biggest issue is to have 2 compulsory pass subjects in matric and a second language that has no material value. That's Fazler there, Indonesia. Appreciate your comments and engagement tonight.